Alright, here we go again. I'm learning something every time I do one of these. For example, it's probably smart to mention that today is Sunday, July 30th, 2006. Alright, Jeremy writes in. He says, does Google treat dynamic pages differently than static pages? My company writes Perl and pages are dynamically created using arguments in the URLs, yada yada yada. Good question. To a first approximation, we do treat static and dynamic pages in similar ways in ranking. So let me explain that in a little more detail. PageRank flows to dynamic URLs in the same way they flow to static URLs. And so if you've got New York Times linking to a dynamic URL, you'll still get the PageRank benefit and it will still flow the PageRank benefit. There are other search engines who in the past have said, okay, we'll go one level deep from static URLs. So we're not going to crawl from a dynamic URL, but we're willing to go into the dynamic URL space from a static URL. So the short answer is PageRank still flows just the same between static and dynamic. Let's go into the more detailed answer. The example you gave actually has 5 parameters, and one of them is like a product ID with like 2725. You definitely can use too many parameters. I would absolutely opt for 2 or 3 at the most if you have any choice whatsoever. And try to avoid long numbers because we can think that those are session IDs. Any extra parameters that you can get rid of are always a good idea. And remember, Google's not the only search engine out there, so if you have the ability to basically say, I'm going to use a little bit of mod rewrite and I'm going to make it look like a static URL, that can often be a very good way to tackle the problem. So PageRank still flows, but experiment. If you don't see any URLs that have the same structure or the same number of parameters as you're thinking about doing, it's probably better if you can either cut back on the number of parameters or shorten them somehow or try to use mod rewrite. Alright, Mark writes in. This is an interesting question. He had a friend whose site was hacked and didn't know about it for a couple months because Google had taken it out or something like that. So he asks, can Google inform the webmaster of this occurrence, basically when your site gets hacked, within Sitemaps? Inform them that maybe inappropriate pages were crawled? That's a really good question. My guess is we don't have the resources to do something like that right now. In general, when somebody's hacked, if they have a small number of sites they're monitoring, they usually notice it pretty quickly, or else the web host will alert them to it. So the Sitemaps team is always willing to work on new things, but my guess is this would be at the lower end of the priority list. Okay. James M. writes in. He says, Matt, in the fullness of time, I'd like to use geotargeting software to deliver different marketing messages to different people in different parts of the world. So, for example, discounted pricing structure. Are we safe to run with this sort of plain vanilla use of geotargeting software? Clearly, we want to avoid any suspicions of cloaking. That's a really meaty question. So let's talk about that a little bit. The way that Google defines cloaking is very specific. It says, showing different content to users than you show to search engines. Now, geotargeting by itself is not cloaking under Google's guidelines, because all you're doing is saying, take the IP address, oh, you're from Canada, we'll show you this particular page. Or take the IP address, you're from Germany, so we'll show you this particular page. The thing that will get you in trouble is if you treat Googlebot in some special way. So if you're geotargeting by country, don't make a special country just for Googlebot. Googlebotistan or anything like that. Instead, what you want to do is treat Googlebot just like a regular user. So if you geotarget by country, we're coming from an IP address that's in the United States, so just give Googlebot whatever the United States users would see. So Google, for example, does geotargeting. We don't consider that cloaking. I think I've explained the subtleties pretty well, but again, cloaking is showing different content to users than to search engines. In this case, you just treat Googlebot like you would any other user based on the fact that they've got this IP address, and you should be totally fine. Alright, let's take another break.